Jailhouse lawyers are prisoners who manage to learn enough about the law while incarcerated to help themselves and other inmates with legal problems. We get letters from them every week. Tonight, we're going to introduce you to Sean Hopwood, who is arguably the most successful jailhouse lawyer ever, having had one of his cases argued before the U.S. Supreme Court while serving a 12-year sentence for armed bank robbery. Since his release, he's built a resume as a legal scholar and been published in top law journals. We met him at one of the nation's premier law schools, where he's become its newest professor. A tale of redemption as improbable as any you're likely to hear.
Question one is, was there a constitutional violation?
In his first semester at Georgetown University, Professor Hopwood is teaching criminal law.
Were the first statements unlawfully obtained? Yes.
The irony isn't lost on him or his students, who know that he's a convicted felon and that less than a decade ago was an inmate at the Federal Correctional Institution in Pekin, Illinois.
You're a professor at one of the finest law schools in the country. Is that something that you thought you would be able to do?
No. It makes me laugh hearing you say it out loud, because there are days where it doesn't make sense to me, and I've lived it. So I can see why it doesn't make sense to hardly anyone else.
It's easier for me to imagine you as a Georgetown law professor than it is for me to imagine you as a bank robber.
Well, that's because the bank robber's long been dead and gone.
Hopwood was born here 42 years ago in the small farming community of David City, Nebraska, surrounded by cornfields and cattle. He was a bright, cocky, stubborn kid from a solid family, and he hated rules. A good athlete and a miserable student who won a basketball scholarship to Midland University and partied his way out of it in one semester. He drank himself through a 2-year hitch in the Navy, then added drugs to the mix when he returned to David City, working in a feedlot.
How much has David City changed since?
He was broke, unrepentant, and frustrated that things weren't going his way.
I wanted to live an exciting life, and shoveling cow manure in small-town Nebraska and living in my parents' bedroom wasn't quite cutting it.
So this is where it started?
One night he got a call from a friend asking him to come down to the local bar for a drink and listen to what turned out to be a very bad idea.
He said, "What do you think about robbing a bank?" And most people would have laughed that off or said, maybe we need another beer, or anything other than, that sounds like a great idea, which is what I ended up saying.
Really?
You know, I don't think either one of us thought that night that we were going to actually do it.
It sounded exciting.
It sounded exciting. It sounded like easy money that we didn't have to work for, something that fit with where my mind was at the time, which was a reckless, immature, foolish 21-year-old.
It wasn't until months later, when they started scouting locations, that Sean realized they might actually do it.
So this is one of your banks?
It is. This is the third bank.
The idea was to stick up very small banks in tiny towns like Gresham, where there was no police presence and little risk of armed confrontation.
We wanted to get in and out of the bank as quickly as possible, not hurt anyone, grab as much money as we could, and run. And that's basically what we did in all 5 bank robberies.
Were you any good at it?
No. I did 11 years in federal prison for stealing $150,000. I don't think that's good.
Eventually, the FBI put out a composite sketch and began closing in. In July 1998, he was apprehended in this Omaha hotel 10 months after his first robbery.
When they arrested me, they searched my car and found $100,000 in cash that was directly traceable to the bank I had just robbed, and multiple guns and a scanner and binoculars.
They had you.
They had me.
And they would have him for a long time. When he entered the federal penitentiary in Illinois in May of 1999, he was 23 years old.
Was it dangerous?
Of course, in part because there's not a lot for the inmates to do.
He doesn't talk about the things that he witnessed and experienced in federal prison. He doesn't want his family to know, and he sees no value in reliving them, except for the job he landed in the safety of the legal library, which every federal prison is required to have.
And for the first 6 months I worked at the prison law library, I didn't hardly touch the books, They were big, they were thick, they were intimidating.
What was the spark that got you to start opening the books and looking at them?
Self-motivation.
It all started with a Supreme Court ruling that Sean thought might help him get his sentence reduced. And it ended with him assisting other prisoners with all sorts of cases.
I spent 2 months working on my own case, researching, and I was never able to get any legal relief for myself the entire time I was in federal prison.
But you were for other inmates.
I did. Lawyers had made really bad mistakes, and it really cost their clients sometimes, a decade or two in federal prison.
Inside the walls at Pekin, he won the respect of fellow inmates and discovered that he had an aptitude for something, the law.
I would be sitting in my cell reading a Federal Reporter, which is a compendium of federal Court of Appeals cases. And I would just read that cover to cover as if it was a novel, just for fun.
Was it fun?
I think the law is fascinating.
In what way?
It was like a big puzzle for me.
3 years into his prison term, he got an opportunity to show just how much he'd learned when John Fellers, a friend and fellow inmate, asked Sean to appeal his drug conviction to the highest court in the land.
He came to me and said, "Would you take the case and would you file this petition to the Supreme Court?" I said, "No, absolutely not."
Why?
His case was very complex, and I didn't think I could do it, but John was very persistent.
He would spend months working day and night on the petition. It required him to master the facts of the case, understand the statutes and legal precedents, identify the errors made by lawyers and judges in the appeal process, and then craft an argument in the language of the court before mailing it off to Washington.
Did the Supreme Court know that the brief had been written by a prisoner?
The first hint would have been the fact that it was typed on a typewriter. I don't think law firms in 2003 were using typewriters to knock out Supreme Court briefs.
4 out of 9 Supreme Court justices must agree for a case to be heard. That year, more than 8,000 petitions were filed. 74 were accepted. One of those was written by Sean Hopwood.
And one morning, a friend of mine came running and screaming my name, "Sean, Sean, Sean." And what he had was a copy of the USA Today, and I read the article and it said that the court had granted John Fellers' case.
What went through your mind?
I was shocked. I was shocked that the court had granted the case and that I had done something that, lawyers wait their whole lives to do, and done it the first time.
It's not that unusual for prisoners to file their own petitions. What is freakishly unusual is for one of those petitions to be granted.
Seth Waxman, a prominent appellate lawyer and the former Solicitor General of the United States, is not easily impressed. But when he was asked to argue the Fellers case before the Supreme Court, he said he would do it only if Sean Hopwood would work from prison as part of the team.
I wanted him to be involved because I was really curious. It seemed actually almost inconceivable that somebody with his level of education and his level of exposure to the life of the law could actually write a much better than average cert petition.
So this would have been good for a Washington lawyer?
Even for a licensed, appointed lawyer representing a federal prisoner, you would say, wow.
Waxman won the Fellers case before the Supreme Court in a unanimous decision and became Sean's mentor during his final 6 years in prison.
When a former Solicitor General of the United States says that you did a good job writing a brief, that has an impact, especially when you're surrounded in this environment where prison guards are telling you every day that you're worthless and you don't amount to anything.
Did you win some more cases?
I did. I won another case in the Supreme Court. I won a case in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I won cases mostly on resentencing motions for federal prisoners and federal district court cases kind of all over the country.
He'd found a purpose in life, and when Anne Marie Metzner, who had once had a high school crush on Sean, began writing letters and paying him visits, he started to think he might have some kind of future when he got out. But he knew there were huge obstacles ahead.
Did you decide you wanted to be a lawyer while you were in prison?
I did, but I didn't think I could. I had had countless number of lawyers tell me I could not go to law school. And even if I could, I would never get licensed by any of the state bar associations, given my crimes.
When he was released to a halfway house near Omaha in 2008, he had never seen an iPhone, never been on the internet, and was computer illiterate. But as if by miracle, he saw an ad for a document analyst at Cockle Legal Printing, one of just a few companies in the U.S. that helps attorneys assemble briefs for the Supreme Court. Andy Cockle and his sister Trish Bellotti remembered that Sean showed up for his interview in ill-fitting clothes with a rumpled letter from Seth Waxman and an 11-year gap in his resume.
We work with attorneys every day, all week long, that are trying to get their case granted, and none of them do. And this guy comes out and says, I had two of them granted.
And so yeah.
Did you believe him?
No. I thought he was delusional.
But his story checked out, and they gave him the job.
You're glad you hired him.
Oh, yeah. It was sad to see him go.
He spent 3 years with the Cockles in Omaha, completing the undergraduate degree he'd begun in prison and continuing to impress the lawyers he worked with. With their help, and against all odds, the University of Washington Law School took a chance on him. He won a full scholarship from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and upon graduation was admitted to the bar.
How did you do in law school?
Surprisingly well.
You're already a lawyer.
Well, I mean, it was a new experience doing well in school.
He did well enough to land a prestigious clerkship with the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, the second most important court in the country.
The idea that a convicted bank robber was going to go work for Janice Rogers Brown, a very conservative judge on a very important court, surprising in the absolute sense, yes. In the context of who Sean Hopwood is and what he was setting out to do, not that surprising.
And the cops go to the
A year later, it led to a highly competitive teaching fellowship at Georgetown Law's Appellate Litigation Clinic, where he did so well, the faculty awarded him a position as a professor of law.
How hard is it to get a job teaching law at Georgetown?
It's very hard.
Professor Stephen Goldblatt is the faculty director for the Supreme Court Institute at Georgetown Law.
To have somebody who's a credible voice, who actually lived the experience, who understands what it's like to spend a day in prison, much less 11 years, is highly unusual. So I think this was a unique opportunity to get somebody for whom there are no others out there, and that the potential was enormous.
Along with his other accomplishments, Sean Hopwood also got to marry that girl from David City, Annie Metzner, who is now a law student herself. They have 2 children.
Are you surprised how this has turned out?
Yeah. I had no idea of what the future would hold for us. Neither one of us had any clue that all these wonderful things would happen.
Thank you.
Hopwood's main interest now is criminal justice reform. He's an advocate for shorter prison sentences for most crimes and more vocational training, drug treatment, and mental health counseling, which are often non-existent.
Prison is not the place for personal growth. We warehouse people and then we kick them out into the real world and with very little support and hope that a miracle happens.
But somehow, all the things stacked against you, you were able to do it.
Yeah. It was people that helped, that went out of their way to provide grace to me, that made the difference.
Over the years, we've done a number of stories about wrongly convicted prisoners who get exonerated when a crusading attorney takes on their case. In prisons around the world, however, that rarely happens. In Kenya, for example, more than 80% of inmates have never been represented by a lawyer. Justice Defenders would like to change that. It's an organization started in Africa by a soft-spoken 37-year-old lawyer named Alexander McLean. Justice Defenders has worked in 55 prisons in Kenya, Uganda, and the Gambia, giving legal training to hundreds of inmates who can then help their fellow prisoners, the innocent and the guilty, get a fair hearing in court. They are also helping some prisoners get law degrees, and as we found out when we visited Kenya before the pandemic, the results have been astounding.
Thika Main Prison outside Nairobi is a miserable place.
built almost 70 years ago to hold 300 prisoners. When we visited 3 years ago, there were more than 1,000. In this one dank holding cell, 140 men were packed tightly together, the air thick with the smell of sweat and urine. They'd been accused of everything from trespassing and robbery to assault and murder. Some have already been convicted, but most have yet to stand trial. They can't afford bail, so they'll likely have to wait here for years.
Good afternoon, brothers. Our work is to help people who don't have lawyers to access justice.
That's Alexander McLean, the founder of Justice Defenders, which has been working in Kenya's prisons for 13 years.
How many of you have a lawyer?
1, 2, 3.
Just 3 men in this group of more than 200 prisoners have an attorney.
We think it's a problem that often poor people go to court without defense.
Defending the defenseless is at the heart of Alexander McLean's mission.
Most of the people who are in prisons in Kenya don't come to court knowing their rights, knowing how a court works.
You might meet people in prison who think that the police are the ones who've convicted them of an offence, or they've never had a copy of their judgment, so they know that they've been convicted, but they don't know exactly what of and why. And so our hope with our work is that we give people fair hearings. So even if they're convicted or they're given a prison sentence, afterwards they say, well, that's fair because my voice has been heard.
Morris Kabiria was sent to Thika prison in 2005. He was a police officer and was accused of stealing a cell phone and credit card.
How much time did you end up in pretrial detention, waiting for your trial?
8 good years.
8 years?
8 years, from 2005 to 2013.
In court, he claimed he'd been framed because he didn't pay a bribe to a superior officer. The judge found him guilty of armed robbery and gave him the mandatory sentence, death.
The death penalty for an armed robbery?
Yes.
When the verdict came, do you remember that day?
Very much. When the judge sentenced me to death, to suffer death by hanging, I just saw blackness everywhere.
McLean took us to Langata Women's Prison in Nairobi, where Justice Defenders has trained 47 inmates to be what they call paralegals. They're given a 3-week law course which enables them to teach other prisoners about bail, court procedures, and rules of evidence. The paralegals also prepare petitions and write appeals challenging inmates' convictions and sentences.
What year did you arrive here?
Jane Manyonge became a paralegal 5 years ago. She was a school teacher when she was charged with killing her husband, who she says was abusive. Convicted of murder, she too was given a mandatory death sentence.
You didn't know your rights?
Never.
How courts work?
Yeah, never. And that's what propelled me to join the paralegal. That legal basic knowledge that I get, it goes a long way. You don't need a degree to draft somebody an appeal or something like that.
How does that feel?
You feel that you are still a human being, even if you are here. You can do something to change somebody's life.
Alexander McLean began volunteering to help others as a teenager, growing up in South London. His father was Jamaican and his mother is English. He first went to Africa when he was 18 to do hospice work in prisons and hospitals in Uganda.
We went onto this ward, and by the toilet on the floor, I saw a man lying on a plastic sheet in a pool of urine. And for 5 days, I washed him and tried to advocate for him. Came the 6th day, and he was lying dead and naked on the floor.
It's not something a lot of people, I think, would volunteer to do.
I guess that sometimes in life we see things that we can't unsee, and then we have a choice as to how we respond to them. Because every person has gifts and talents and something to contribute to our society. Our society can only flourish when the inherent worth of each person is valued.
After returning to London and graduating from law school, he could have gotten a high-paying job. Instead, in 2007, he started a charity to improve conditions in African prisons. At Nairobi's Committee Maximum Security Prison, a notorious and sometimes violent place, he met George Karaba, who was on death row for killing a man in a dispute over land.
I remember the first thing that we asked was how he can be able to provide us with reading materials.
So McLean began collecting whatever books he could find for the prisoners.
My sense was that books could transform us and transform our circumstances and take us to a different place.
9, 10, 11.
Prison authorities had already started an academy of their own, with classes from first grade through high school, teaching math, English, science, and religion. And with McLean's help, they turned a room at the end of a cell block into a library.
You can't imagine the happiness. You can't imagine.
Just from a book?
Yeah. Because when I start reading this book and it's actually enlightening me, it's like now I'm being opened up to the outside world. It started giving us hope.
McLean wanted to do more than just improve life in Kenya's prisons. He wanted to make sure those accused of crimes had a fair hearing.
Often it's people from backgrounds of privilege who become lawyers or become politicians and make the law, but it's the poorest people in our societies who disproportionately feel the impact of the law. And I wondered what it looked like to tap into that lived experience.
So in 2012, McLean arranged with the University of London Law School for inmates to begin taking a 3-year correspondence course, the same one Nelson Mandela took when he was in prison. To qualify, they have to pass an entrance exam and have a track record of helping other prisoners while they've been behind bars.
So even if they may have murdered somebody and have a life sentence, if they have transformed themselves in prison, if they are serving others, they might be able to qualify.
Yes, because we believe that there's more to someone that's killed than being a murderer, or more to someone that's who's stolen than being a thief. I don't think any of us has to be defined by the worst thing that we've done.
Remember Morris Kibiria, the cop in for armed robbery? He enrolled in law school and found the learning curve steep.
I had never touched a computer in my life before I went to prison.
Really?
Yes. I touched the first computer in that law class.
Were you all right?
In some ways, they are like law students anywhere. In the chapel at Committee Maximum Security Prison, we watched as they held a moot court, a mock legal hearing where they role play, arguing cases with all the gravitas and grandeur of a real Kenyan courtroom. Some prisoners play prosecutors.
The society as a whole needs protection.
Others, the defense.
It is better to acquit 9 guilty suspects than convict 1 innocent person.
There's also a defendant.
We proceed.
And prisoner judges to render a verdict.
The appellants have proved the appeal.
You may have noticed prison guards in attendance. Remarkably, some of them are taking law classes as well. Willie Ojolu is the chief inspector at Langata Women's Prison and just completed his University of London law degree.
I don't know that I know of many guards in the United States who train to become a lawyer so they can give legal advice to the people they're guarding. It's pretty unique.
Wow, it sounds unique, but that's what happens here. You know, people are brought to prison as a punishment, but not for punishment.
I've never heard it phrased that way. So your goal is not to punish them, but
to help them improve on their life and manage their life properly so that they don't get in conflict with the law.
3 years ago, inside Committee Maximum Security Prison, there was a graduation ceremony the likes of which no one here had ever seen. 18 inmates, former prisoners and guards, received their University of London Law School degrees. George Karaba got his, and while he may spend the rest of his life in prison, he says he's been transformed.
If I do not get out of prison, I will still continue doing what I do.
to see somebody you've helped get out of prison.
It gives me great satisfaction.
Does it feel like part of you goes out with that person?
I feel part of me is actually out, and therefore I'm good.
George Karaba and others helped Morris Kibiria appeal his death penalty conviction. Kibiria argued the case himself and was stunned when the judge acquitted him of all charges after 13 years in prison.
I felt like I did not hear right. So I asked her, what? She told me, hey, come on. I thought you were a lawyer.
You didn't believe what she was saying? You wanted to see it in writing?
I don't believe it can happen that way. Because it was not even in my mind.
First impression is very important.
Morris Kibiria was freed, but when he got out, he went right back to prison as a full-time employee of Justice Defenders. Here he is teaching inmates a lesson he learned in court firsthand. Always look the judge straight in the eye.
Don't just lie low. Don't keep quiet. It might affect your defense or your case.
Justice Defenders says since we visited Kenya, they've provided more than 37,000 legal services to prisoners and seen almost 11,000 people released. This was Pauline Njeri's walk to freedom after 5 years in prison for fraud.
Yes, thank you, darling, for coming.
Her daughter was there to greet her.
Some of the people that your paralegals are training have committed very serious offenses.
For sure.
Do they really deserve a chance to get out if they've really committed those crimes?
We're not determining sentence. Those who are guilty of offences should be punished, and the punishment should be proportionate, and it should be viewed towards equipping them one day to leave prison and to contribute to society. But those who are innocent shouldn't be wrongly punished.
Justice Defenders relies entirely on donations and spends about $2 million a year helping inmates. They've begun trying to expand their work into other prisons in Africa, Europe, and the United States.
We have a shared hunger for justice.
Already, their impact in Kenya has been profound. Morris Kabiria was part of a team of Justice Defenders who successfully challenged the constitutionality of Kenya's mandatory death sentence. The law was changed, and as a result, thousands of death row inmates became eligible for resentencing.
That must feel extraordinary.
Extraordinary. I love law. I love law. I eat law, I drink law, I love law.
You eat and drink it?
I completely, everything. I do everything with law.
Listening to you talk about the law, it sort of makes me excited about the law.
Yes. Let me tell you, Cooper. You know, there is one thing we do. We make assumptions as people, as a society, and we dig our graves through those assumptions. Law is not for lawyers. Law is not for the government. Law is not for some people somewhere or the rich. Law is for everyone.
In the coming weeks, 100,000 inmates will have been advised by Justice Defenders. With their planned expansion into new prisons and countries, they aim to serve 1 million prisoners by 2030. In the past year, hundreds of people accused of crimes in New Orleans have been stuck in jail, defenseless, denied their constitutional right to a lawyer. It's happening because the city's public defenders, attorneys who are supposed to represent those who can't afford private lawyers, have been staging a kind of protest. They say they're so overworked and underfunded, they don't have the time or resources to defend their clients properly. So they've been refusing to represent people charged with some of the most serious crimes, rapes, robberies, and murder. The man who made this startling decision is the chief public defender, Derwin Bunton. He says he didn't have a choice because the criminal justice system in America is so broken, it's become just a criminal processing system.
What does that mean, a processing system?
Think about I Love Lucy. They have that famous scene where she and Ethel are trying to wrap chocolates. And their job is grab the chocolates and wrap them and get them back on the conveyor belt. Our criminal justice system has become something of a conveyor belt that starts with you arrested, and then there's hands that touch you on the way to prison. It is not about figuring out at any point your innocence. Should you even be on this conveyor belt no matter what you did?
That's a pretty frightening picture you paint. I mean, that's not a justice system. That's a system sending people to prison.
And that's what we're fighting to change.
Derwin Bunton has been head of the New Orleans Public Defender's Office for the last 8 years. The 52 lawyers on his staff are responsible for representing more than 20,000 people a year who are unable to afford a private attorney.
How do 50 attorneys handle 22,000 cases?
You do your best, but a lot of times you can't provide the kind of representation that the Constitution, our Code of Ethics, and professional standards would have you provide.
It was a year ago in January that Bunton announced his public defenders would no longer take on any felony cases in which defendants were facing a possible life in prison. That left hundreds waiting in jail without lawyers.
Isn't having a busy public defender better than languishing in jail without any kind of attorney?
No. No. A lawyer poorly resourced can cause irreparable harm to a client.
We sat down with 9 current and former New Orleans public defenders who all admit they simply do not have the time or the budget to adequately represent all their clients.
How many of you believe that an innocent client went to jail because you didn't have enough time to spend on their case? All of you. You feel you've all had that experience?
We simply don't have the time. We don't have the money. We don't have the attention to be able to give to every single person.
It's not for lack of skill. Sarah Chervinsky went to Yale and won an award for Best Young Trial Lawyer in the country.
A lot of us went to law schools with good criminal defense, clinics. We come into this job being told, like, here's what you do to investigate, here's how often you visit your client. And as soon as you start working, you realize the gap between what you should be doing and what you can do.
It's unethical, it's unconstitutional. The judges know it, the prosecutors know it, the Bar Association knows it, and it has to come to an end.
Stephen Hanlon is general counsel for the National Association for Public Defense. He's just concluded a study in conjunction with the American Bar Association, finding Louisiana public defenders are handling nearly 5 times as much work as they should.
Each public defender is doing the work of what 5 public defenders
That's exactly right.
Would any other profession be asked to work this kind of a load?
If obstetricians had 5 times as much work as they could handle competently, if airline pilots had 5 times as much work as they could handle competently, terrible things would happen.
It wouldn't be allowed. I mean, there's strict regulations.
Of course it wouldn't be allowed.
Public defenders have people's lives in their hands just like airline pilots or doctors.
They have people's lives in their hands. They have people's liberty in their hands. They have their whole future in their hands.
Donald Gamble knows what it's like to have your future rest in the hands of a New Orleans public defender. In February 2015, he was out celebrating Mardi Gras in this neighborhood when the police pulled up.
The detective, he just jumped out and he was like, Donald Gamble, you're under arrest. And
did they tell you what you were under arrest for?
Yeah, he said you're under arrest for 2 counts of armed robbery.
A man with a gun stole 2 women's purses. The robber was recorded fleeing by security cameras, and a witness identified 26-year-old Donald Gamble. His bail was set at $300,000. Unable to afford a private attorney, Gamble was assigned a public defender.
Did you have confidence in your public defender? Did you ever feel like, okay, she's really investigating, they're really on it?
I never once really felt that she was making progress. I could tell every time I would interact with her, she just seemed busy, rushed. She seemed overworked.
Gamble had some prior nonviolent offenses on his record, but now found himself facing possible life in prison. Even so, court records show that for more than 10 months, his case went nowhere. Gamble was locked up in a jail that was recently cited by the Department of Justice for its violence and inhumane conditions.
Did you have problems in jail?
Yes.
What happened?
As you can see, I've got my front teeth knocked out, and I've had stitches.
So you got attacked more than once?
Absolutely, yeah.
To protect himself, he says he got a homemade knife, which was confiscated by authorities. Lindsay Samuel was Gamble's public defender. She told us she couldn't spend much time on his case because she was already struggling to represent nearly 100 men facing life in prison. Nearly a year after Donald Gamble was arrested, Samuel quit her job.
Why'd you leave?
Feeling like you're always coming up short. The first 1,000 clients, you feel terrible. The second 1,000 clients, you feel awful. The third 1,000, 3,000 in, it doesn't feel so bad anymore. One morning I woke up and I just felt like, I'm not even angry about this anymore. It's just every day to me. Every day my clients are going away for a decade, and I just move along to the next client.
Samuel left just as the public defender's office started refusing cases. That meant Donald Gamble, stuck in jail, had no one representing him. But surprisingly, that turned out to be a good thing. A judge appointed Pamela Metzger, a constitutional scholar and Tulane law professor, to advise him and 6 other men on their Sixth Amendment right to legal counsel. Metzger argued that if the state couldn't provide the men with effective representation, they should all be released immediately.
Some of these men were charged with very serious crimes.
Rape, murder, armed robbery.
You live in New Orleans, you have a family here.
Yep.
Do you want them back on the street?
I want to live in a city where the Constitution matters, and I want to live in a city where everybody knows that if you get arrested, you're going to have a lawyer, and you're going to have a lawyer who represents you properly.
Pamela Metzger's job wasn't to disprove the charges against Donald Gamble, but as soon as she started looking at the case file, she says she realized the eyewitness who identified Gamble was unreliable. Then she took the time to examine those security camera recordings of the robber. When she studied them closely, she realized Gamble didn't fit the description at all.
I noticed the pants, and there's a flat, wide cuff to the pant. The pant cuffs are swinging as this person runs.
These are the pants police said Donald Gamble was wearing during the robbery.
These are tight on the bottom.
These are old school sweatpants that are elasticized bottoms. See right there? That straight line?
Right.
It's impossible for those pants to have made that.
As soon as you saw that, you knew.
As soon as I saw that, I knew.
How many hours did it take you to determine they had the wrong guy?
I would say put together 4 or 5 hours of work.
If a public defender has too many cases, has too big a workload.
They don't have 4 to 5 hours. They don't. They don't have 4 to 5 hours.
Days after reviewing the case, Pamela Metzger presented the evidence, including the security camera videos, to the judge.
I got a call at home that night from the district attorney saying we're dropping it. And the paperwork was filed the next day.
Last June, after 16 months in jail, Donald Gamble was freed. He left for Houston immediately to live with his grandmother.
Good to see you. You look so good.
You do too, baby.
So good.
Yeah.
You're looking young, girl.
Back at home, there was relief and disbelief.
You see, I got my teeth knocked out.
It's pathetic.
You'll be all right.
It's time for you to have some good luck.
To someone watching who says, look, it's unfortunate that some innocent people end up in jail, but no system's perfect, and it's the cost of doing business to keep people safe.
We didn't keep people safe. We put Donald Gamble in jail, the wrong man, and let the actual robber out on the streets for 16 more months. Who knows how many other people he robbed? The cost of not having a good public defender is not just to the defendant. It's to the victims, and it's to all the future victims.
Gamble, who was arrested again last month for disturbing the peace, had always insisted he was innocent of the robbery, but told us he was so scared in jail, he considered pleading guilty.
You were facing potentially life in prison.
Yes.
If your attorney had been able to get a plea bargain for, say, 5 years, would you have taken it?
Absolutely. If you ask yourself that same question, would you rather 5 years or 99 years?
You would have pled guilty to something you didn't do.
Most definitely.
That doesn't surprise Derwin Bunton, the city's chief public defender. He says their clients know they don't have the time and money to mount a rigorous defense at trial, so often decide to take plea deals even if they aren't guilty.
People are pleading guilty to crimes they didn't do.
All the time.
All the time.
This is not just an isolated thing here and there.
This is not isolated. This is a system that has grown so large without any counterbalance that it has produced the highest incarceration rate in the world.
And you're supposed to be that counterbalance.
That's exactly right.
To illustrate his point, Bunton took us to this warehouse where the public defender's cases from the past decade are stored.
About how many cases are there here?
It's roughly about 500,000.
And how many pled guilty?
You're probably looking at somewhere between 90, 95%.
95% of these people were guilty?
Well, they pled guilty.
I think people haven't been in the system find the notion that somebody would plead guilty to something in a plea deal that they didn't actually do. Hard to imagine.
Say you're picked up for something you didn't do and you're placed in jail. Jail is a terrible place to be. And you find out through your public defender that if you plead to this, maybe it's this lesser thing, maybe it's guilty as charged, you'll get out today. People will take that plea because they want to get out of jail.
But plea deals, Bunton says, often lead to serious consequences when someone has a criminal record.
Louisiana is a state that has a lot of misdemeanor multiples, as we call them. That means if you get one misdemeanor is the misdemeanor, a second one turns it into a felony.
So if you're arrested on a misdemeanor and then a couple of months later it happens again, that becomes a felony?
That's right. The second time, it's a felony. And the penalties increase for each subsequent time that you're caught.
These public defenders say they see harsh sentences based on prior felonies and misdemeanors all the time.
I had a client who's doing 20 years for stealing a flat of soda that was worth less than $100.
I have a client
that was sentenced to 17 years for half an ounce of weed. No crimes of violence in his past.
In recent months, the public defender's office here has gotten some relief. The state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans have come up with more money, and Derwin Bunton has hired 9 additional attorneys. But he insists he'll continue to turn away cases until he can ensure every client gets the defense they deserve.
Here we have a criminal justice system, stories of innocence throughout and profound. And we still haven't had the urgency that I think we need to reform it so that we don't destroy lives. Because make no mistake, we're destroying lives.
And you don't want to be part of it anymore?
We're not going to be complicit in that kind of injustice. No, we're not going to do it anymore.
Ever heard of litigation funding? It's a relatively new, multi-billion-dollar industry where investors fund lawsuits. Here's the idea. Say someone was wronged by a big corporation but has no money to sue it. A litigation funder will pay for their court battle. In essence, they're betting on the lawsuit the way traders bet on stocks. If it's successful, they make money, sometimes a lot of money. If it fails, the funders get nothing. Their investment is lost. As we first reported in December, litigation funding can help in cases where otherwise the little guy who's suing would just get crushed or lowballed by defendants with deep pockets. Problem is, this market is exploding with nearly no rules or oversight.
This is quite an honor to be able to drive you around in my truck.
We start our story in the rolling hills of Ventura County, California.
This is one of our fields.
This one too? Where Craig Underwood's family farm had been growing jalapenos for 3 decades. So you used to have peppers as far as the eye could see.
As you were driving through the valley, peppers were every place.
But I heard that you had one customer.
One customer, Hui Fong Foods.
Hui Fong makes the world-famous sriracha hot sauce. In 2016, they abruptly severed ties with Underwood. His business dried up overnight. Is there anything growing here at all? Can you tell?
There's nothing planted here, and up here, it's just weeds.
Facing ruin, he sued Hui Fong for breach of contract and won $23 million. But they appealed.
They appealed.
You couldn't collect any of the money.
No. We were looking at whether we could survive or not. You know, every week we were trying to find enough cash to pay the bills, make sure we could make payroll.
He couldn't afford to keep fighting until he heard of an investment firm that backs people in his situation.
We make the playing field level, and that's what people should be wanting in litigation.
Christopher Bogart is the CEO of Burford Capital. He funds litigants and takes a chunk of their reward if they win.
We are a multi-billion-dollar company because litigation is expensive and there's an awful lot of demand from businesses for this kind of solution.
So is it a loan?
It's a non-recourse financing. So
what does
non-recourse?
What does that mean?
What it means is that if the case that we're financing doesn't succeed, then we don't get our money back. And so it's different from a loan in the sense that a loan, obviously, you're always having to pay back the principal.
If your side loses, you get nothing.
That's correct.
Still, Craig Underwood was torn because if he won the appeal, Burford would get a big chunk. But seeing no other choice, he took $4 million from them. Soon after, he won the appeal and the $23 million. But then he had to pay his lawyers and square away with Burford.
We had to give them $8 million to pay for the 4 that we got and the 4 that, you know, was there.
Did you think when you realized they were going to charge you 100% that was predatory?
Some people might think that. I didn't feel that way because they stepped in and helped us out when we couldn't have gotten money from anybody else. They basically rescued us.
Founded in 2009, Burford is the world's largest litigation funder with $5 billion invested in multiple lawsuits. Is it actually safer in today's environment to invest in litigation than in the stock market?
Well, the benefit that you get from litigation is that litigation doesn't fluctuate the same way that the markets do.
What's your average investment?
When we're financing a single piece of litigation, it would be very rare for us to be below $5 million, and it goes up from there.
Let's say you have a huge case with tens of millions of dollars. What kind of percentage do you expect to win at the end?
On an average basis, we'll largely double our money.
Are there cases where you actually walked away with more money than the plaintiff, the person who was wronged?
So that doesn't happen very often.
But occasionally.
It certainly can happen.
There's no legal limit on how big a chunk litigation funders can take, and the deals are confidential. Bogert argues that the reason they demand so much is because of the big risks they take. But actually, they pick their cases very carefully. So these are all lawyers?
Indeed they are.
And what are they doing? Do you
They
know?
are fundamentally vetting potential cases that we might finance for corporate clients. We certainly do diligence on those matters to try to choose ones that are meritorious and that will be successful.
How often are you right?
We're right about 90% of the time, and we're wrong about 10% of the time.
What if the client that you've given all this money to, invested in, wants to settle, and you think that's a mistake?
Clients are free to run their litigations as they see fit. They're free to work with their lawyers as they see fit, and we don't interfere with that relationship. It's not uncommon for them to come and ask for our advice, but it's advice, and the client is free to disregard that advice and take its own path. But Maya Steinitz, a law professor at the University of Iowa, says there are ethics rules for lawyers, but not for these investors.
The funders are not regulated. There's nothing precluding them legally from pressuring a client to settle. The rules of ethics are very clear that the lawyer has to abide by the wishes of the client. But human nature is human nature.
Yes.
There may be an inclination to be pulled towards the person who is paying.
Why is this important? Why should someone out there who's not involved in a lawsuit care?
For multiple reasons. First of all, there's this new industry and a new type of player, litigation funders, who are reshaping every aspect of the litigation process. Which cases get brought, how long are they pursued, when are they settled. But all of this is happening without transparency. So we have one of the three branches of government, the judiciary, that's really being quietly transformed. And there's
very little oversight.
Very little oversight.
Who is working to impose regulations, insist on transparency in this industry?
One entity that's been very vocal is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that represents big businesses, because the sector that's most concerned about this is big corporations. Now there's money to sue them, and there's money to persevere and not to settle early at a discount.
Big business would
Big
like
business.
to have regulation. How
Yes.
interesting, because they
Yes.
don't like regulation. Except
Generally.
when it helps them.
Generally.
Burford usually funds huge cases involving big, sophisticated corporations. There are only a handful of investment firms like it whose business is solely investing in litigation. But hedge funds, foreign government funds, and wealthy individuals are also getting into this market. But because there are no regulations, in most cases, litigation funders remain anonymous in court. In 2012, a billionaire, Peter Thiel, secretly funded wrestler Hulk Hogan's invasion of privacy lawsuit against the website Gawker that drove it out of business. Thiel had his own long-standing score to settle with the site.
If you've been injured in an accident...
But litigation funding isn't just for giant cases worth gazillions.
You can get cash as soon as the same day.
These ads are for a whole other category of litigation funding companies that offer quick cash.
You can get cash in as little as 24 hours.
Directly to individuals who are suing in smaller cases, usually over personal injury accidents.
From 500 to...
They need the money to pay their household bills so they can hold out for larger settlements.
The beauty of pre-settlement funding is that if you lose,
You don't have to pay back anything.
Call now.
But in the ads, it's easy to miss that if you win, you might have to pay a hefty sum. This group of litigation funders charges so much because, again, they say the risk is so high, especially given that the applicants for these advances are often broke, injured, out of work, and with no assets. But we found rates running high even when there's seemingly minimal or no risk. Take the case of former NYPD officer Donald Sefcik, who was entitled to money from the 9/11 Victims' Compensation Fund. He became ill after he raced to ground zero. And how long did you stay?
I stayed there approximately 9 days.
Inhaling all that
Yes.
dust
Yeah.
and...
It was so much dust down there that you could not see your hand in front of your face.
So obviously you had medical issues.
Yeah, I couldn't run, I couldn't breathe.
So you were entitled from that Victims' Compensation Fund
Yes, I
to get
was.
$90,000.
Yes,
You were told you would get $90,000. You got $10,000 up front.
yes.
He knew he would eventually get more. But in the meantime, he needed money for his medical care. So an ad in the paper caught his eye.
And it said R&D Legal Funding can get your money faster. We can cut through the red tape.
Oh.
So I called R&D Legal Funding. But then after I signed all the documents and sent over to them, they came back at an interest rate that I couldn't even figure out. The document was very confusing. I couldn't even understand it.
I'm a lawyer, 40 years. I couldn't understand it.
Michael Barish is Sefcik's lawyer.
They lent him $25,000. He had to repay $64,800.
That's 150%. And you paid it? Did you?
I had no choice. I had no choice. I paid it. Out of the $90,000, I ended up with about $30,000 of it. I feel totally just taken advantage of.
The argument from this industry is that they take a big risk when they invest this money.
This is not a car accident case against a small insurance company. This was the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund created by Congress and backed by the U.S. Treasury.
The company told us Sefcik's contract was clear, but his case was part of a lawsuit against RD Legal brought by the New York Attorney General. It settled in November. The company denied wrongdoing, but had to provide over $600,000 in debt relief to harmed consumers, stop doing business with recipients of 9/11 victim compensation funds, and pay a $1 penalty. So how do litigation funders like this get away with charging such exorbitant rates? If you take out, say, a car loan, usury laws that prevent predatory lending cap the interest rate, in New York at 16%. But remember, these aren't loans per se, they're investments. Litigation funders, for giant and personal cases, argue that this market is offering a lifeline to those who have nowhere else to turn. And legal scholars like Maya Steinitz agree.
Accessing the courts in a civil process is a luxury good in today's America. Lawyers charge hundreds of dollars by the hour, so if you've been injured, if you've been discriminated against, if a contract that you have entered into has been breached, it's simply too expensive to bring your case in court. So I think litigation funding is essential. However, personally, I think that litigation funding should be regulated, but I certainly don't think it should be prohibited.